your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live, this is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. It is the Wednesday edition of Point of View, and as we announced yesterday, going to be talking about the really interesting question: when your kids graduate from high school, is it a concern that they might also graduate from God? And what can we do to really stem that tide? That's something we've talked about so many times here on Point of View. And again, once again, we want to come back to the topic of the Mind Games Camp, something we promote every single year. And so we're going to spend some time talking about that. But then stay tuned, because we're going to also tell you a little bit about one of the presentations that Dr. Ray Bohlin did at the Discovery Institute, which I suspect will also be an opportunity to hear one of the talks that might actually be there at the Mind Games Camp. And then a little bit later, we're going to talk about Up Periscope, because that is a program that I think your church will want to actually implement as well. So a lot to cover. But first of all, Dr. Ray Bohlin, good friend of the ministry, of course, a vice president for vision outreach for Probe Ministries, an individual that has his PhD from the University of Texas at Dallas, also a research fellow at the Discovery Institute. We're going to be talking more about that in just a minute, Ray. Yep. Always great to have you in the program.
Thank you, Kurt. Glad to be here.
Sue Bohlin, of course, is married to Ray, but also is the web mistress for Probe Ministries. Matter of fact, we have a link to probe.org. You're going to want to go there in just a few minutes. Also speaks at MOPS and is very much involved in these activities as well. So, Sue, always great to have you as well.
I am so honored to be here with you, Kerby. Thank you.
Let's talk about, for a minute, Sue, with the idea of a Mind Games Camp. Some people asked the other day, when did that start? And I said, well, if you think about it, when Probe Ministries started in 1973, Jimmy Williams and John Buell did, even that summer, what was called a Spartan summer. Then later they had a college prep, and of course now we have the Mind Games Camp. So almost since the beginning, I remember the first brochure I got to use to raise support said, when your kids go off to college, where they lose their faith. So this has been something we've been working on for quite some time, isn't it?
It is a passion for us, because we've been watching what happens to the faith of young people over the literal decades that we've had the privilege of serving God this way. And we are so grateful that we get to do something very practical, very intensely personal with the kids who come to our Mind Games Camp, which we've been doing for how many years? I mean, we're getting
I think
close
94 to when we started.
Getting, okay.
31 years.
31 years. We've been doing this a long time. and we've been in it, Ray and I, since the beginning of the camp, the week-long camp, and it's our favorite thing we do all year.
Ray, let's talk about that, because we're talking about gathering students together. Mm-hmm. And in just a minute, some people say, well, how is it different than Summit Ministries? We'll get to that, because, of course, we know Jeff Myers and other individuals. But this one is a one-week camp, but it's much more really interpersonal, if you will, mm-hmm. because you hang out with the students, you eat with them, there's role play. And as important as it is to hear all the great lectures that you hear in some of these other camps, this one, I think, has been one that has been a favorite, because the students really get to know you and they get to ask any possible question mm-hmm. that comes to mind, right?
Yeah, well, it's a smaller group than you'll have out at Summit. We can have anywhere from 20 to 30, 35 students, and that's a small enough number that all of them get to know each other. And they do spend a lot of time over meals and recreational time together, and really have forged deep friendships, and some of them continue for decades afterwards. We do have a couple who married, and they met at Mind Games.
Well, this particular couple not only met and married, but they have several children. And I just got an email saying, please keep doing Mind Games, because our oldest son is only 2 years away from being ready to come. It's like, whoa.
That's a little strange.
Oh,
Yeah.
that is.
Makes you feel old, doesn't it?
It does.
Yeah, we're not going to go with the OLD thing.
Yes, it does.
Let me just give some of the basics. You can go to the website right now and click on the picture either of Ray or Sue, and it will take you to probe.org. But if you go there, you'll see for the Mind Games Camp taking place June 15th to the 21st. And if people want to know more about that, we'll be talking about it along the way. But I wanted to make sure that at least a month ahead of time or so, people had a chance to schedule this, because you do, in some respects, have to carve out a week. But I think it is helpful because, Ray, you've taught at Summit Ministries up there in Manitou Springs, Colorado. I've taught at the one at Bryan College, and appreciate our friends at Summit. I was just with a breakfast with some individuals who sent their kids to Summit, but that's kind of 2 weeks. It's a little more expensive.
Yep.
Here is an opportunity that if you can carve out 1 week, which is a lot easier for a summer job, and again, it's less expensive, and we even have some scholarships, this is something that I would hope parents and especially grandparents would think about, right?
We have lots of grandparents who've sent their grandkids to Mind Games, and they keep doing so. And yeah, even when I taught at Summit, I didn't really get to know hardly any of the students very well. But here, since it's a smaller group, we eat meals with them. We don't sit at a faculty table. We mix among the students over meals, and we get a chance to talk to them. They can ask us questions during that time as well. And you mentioned earlier about get any question answered that they want. Well, Sue has designed something we call the Ask Box. It looks like an X box, okay, so the Ask Box. And we tell the students, you can write out any question, anything. And during the week, as the questions accumulate, we'll start answering those come Wednesday, Thursday. And yeah, they're for many of them, they've never had that opportunity. They all have lots of questions, as you would expect. If the faith of their parents is going to become their own, they have to go through a period of asking some deep questions. And so, yeah, some of the presentations we do are geared towards answering some of those up front, but we get basic theological questions and all kinds of things that we answer. Yeah. And they're very grateful for that.
Yes. And Sue, that's part of it, is that sometimes they are afraid to ask it or not encouraged to ask it in the youth group, or they ask it and the youth leader says, I'm not really an expert on gender studies, or I really don't know that much about science. One of the reasons I brought two of you in here to talk about some of your topics that you address. These are really cutting edge issues that they're going to have to encounter, even if they go to a Christian school, but especially if they go to a state school. And these are opportunities for them to be prepared before they end up on the campus or in the classroom.
And that's what happens, too, because we hear from kids who then go on to college or come back from college saying, what a difference this has made in this past year, especially. And they do feel equipped, which we are very grateful for. And we tell them, we are not afraid of your questions. And if we don't know the answer, we do have internet access at the camp, which is Camp Copus in Denton, Texas. So it's in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. And we will dig, to get you answers. But last year I made the mistake of saying, we've been doing this for so long that we've never gotten any questions, new questions. Everything is repeats. Well, they took that as a challenge. So we got some of the most bizarre, arcane questions. I won't be saying that this year.
Well, let's take a break. When we come back, we're going to talk about some of the course material, what you cover. And then I do want to have Ray talk about, and if you go to the website right now, you'll also see something about woodpeckers, and I'll get into that. But I think you'll get an idea of how there is just so much evidence for intelligent design, and you'll hear some of that right after these important messages.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
The Chinese Communist Party has been cheating international trade, and many are happy that Trump's tariffs are giving China what it deserves. Katie Pavlich documents the more than 2 decades of lying, stealing, and wildly nefarious trade practices. Many admit that they made a mistake letting China into the World Trade Organization. The communist leaders came in with ambitions of global dominance and used the special rules and treatment to operate inside the United States and all over the world with little scrutiny, even buying up American farmland next to sensitive military sites. China steals intellectual property and then uses it to put American companies out of business. Tech Diplomacy reports after acquiring intellectual property, Chinese government subsidies and regulations help Chinese companies secure market shares in the global markets at the expense of the U.S. And according to a CNBC survey, 1 in 5 corporations say that China has stolen intellectual property within the last year, and 1 in 3 said that it happened sometime during the previous century. China has used its Belt and Road Initiative to gain foothold in African countries. Katie Pavlich tells the sad story of how China helped build infrastructure in Zambia. Their government started to take out loans from Chinese banks for airports, hospitals, housing projects, and the roads connecting them. In the end, not only were the so-called loans an unforgivable trap, but the infrastructure was also built with Chinese labor, not locals, and it's falling apart just like the cheap Chinese goods sold at Walmart. Trump has had enough and is now slapping reciprocal tariffs on China. That is why Katie Pavlich and many others are celebrating that China finally gets its due. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free booklet on a biblical view on big data, go to viewpoints.info/data. That's viewpoints.info/data.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, as we are talking about the Mind Games camp, just a few minutes, we're going to get into this whole issue of, does the common woodpecker give evidence of intelligent design? I have Dr. Ray Bohlin's book from 1984, and he did mention it there in the book and had some very interesting things, but we've learned so much more since that book came out, and so we'll get into that. I think you'll really enjoy that, and that will be just an illustration of the kind of thing that are oftentimes covered at a Mind Games camp. But Sue, first of all, let's go through the basics, because I think you'll be doing that for the alumni session. The basics are starting with worldview, right?
That's our foundation. Is we present 3 basic buckets for for the kids to understand that everybody falls into either theism, believing in God, atheism, naturalism, there is nothing outside the physical universe, or pantheism, that all is God, all is one. And so everybody's worldview fits in one of those 3 buckets. With that as a foundation, then we move on to the basic classic apologetics. So 3 of those: evidence that for the existence of God, evidence of the Bible's reliability, and evidence for Jesus as God's Son. And then after that, we move into cultural apologetics. So wide range of quite a few science presentations that Ray gives. It is nice to have a PhD around. It's helpful. So there's also sexuality. There's relationships. We do guys are from Mars, girls are from Venus. How to watch a movie. Sometimes we do world religions, other topics. You can, on our website, on the Probe website, you can see the general schedule for the week. We have about 20 or 21 different sessions throughout the week, so we give them a lot to chew on, and then to discuss with each other in small groups.
Let me just mention, if you go to the website right now, pointofview.net, or just go directly to pointofview to probe.org, either way, you will see some of the material. I clicked on that. Then you'll see something that says Mind Games, and then you can actually click on the Learn More. One of the issues that they have there is a typical daily schedule. And Ray, I might just point out that in addition to, of course, you having graduate degrees, the individual does apologetics, has been at Biola and a number of other places, been in other ministries doing apologetics. But help us out with the science for a few minutes, because it does seem to me that there are a lot of questions that young people have about this issue of creation, evolution, and intelligent design, right?
Right. And we are seeing a big resurgence among Christian young people to abandon any kind of creationist view and go along with something that we call theistic evolution. In other words, what God used evolution as his method to create. And that's been causing a lot of problems. So for some students, even in high school, they've made that switch. And I like to be able to show them that, well, there is no reason, there's no scientific reason to be a theistic evolutionist, because the evidence for Darwinian evolution simply doesn't work, and we've been showing that now for a few decades through Discovery Institute and my association with them, and so I have a session on the origin of life in the universe. I have a session on evolution or intelligent design, which goes into more animal and plant structures, I mean, the students find it fascinating that most of them have never heard these sorts of things before. And so it opens a few pages of a new book.
Well, and again, if they're going to be going into the medical field, they're just going to go even into some area of science, they're going to have to confront that issue. And for them to know that there are answers, even if they don't know all the answers you know, I think really gives them some confidence, right?
Absolutely. And what I always like to tell students is that if somebody asks you a question you don't know the answer to, you simply tell, well, that's a really good question. I don't really have an answer at the moment, but let me do some research, and can we meet again? Well, you've just set up another meeting. I mean, sometimes it's going to be helpful to not know the answer to a certain question. Take some time and research it.
Let me point out, too, that not everybody is a science nerd, and some of them start looking like they're slightly panicking when they see all the science stuff, and I tell them, you don't have to learn all the arcane knowledge Dr. Ray has for you. If all this does is make you want to worship God so much more because he's so much bigger and smarter and more brilliant than you thought, then that's a win for us.
Again, it's June 15th to the 21st, but I thought, Ray, I might even point out the fact that you are known for something else on what you do for the very first session, and it is one that I think has always had such a profound impact. Talk about that.
Well, I do the opening introductory session, and I start it by role-playing a local professor. Sometimes I call him Professor Jaime Schwartz, whatever. And I'm doing research on the religious beliefs of young people, and your staff has allowed me to come in. I just have some questions for you. So I'm just going to get started. I just pick somebody out, and I say, are you a Christian? Yeah. Why? And the glaze comes over their eyes. Why? I start getting whatever response they have. I have an automatic follow-up to that because I've heard most of those responses in all these years. And it doesn't take long before these students don't want to talk to me anymore.
Yes.
And ordinarily with the first one, somebody in the background starts laughing or giggling, and I try, oh, you think this is funny? Well, what about you? Nobody laughs after that. And I tell them, it's not to embarrass you, to help you to see you really need to be here. You need, we're told to be able to give a defense or an answer to anyone who asks you. And what more basic question could you be asked than, why are you a Christian? And you ought to have a response in your mind to that. I walk through a 4-part response for them. I'm not going to give any of the evidences here, but first of all, I'm convinced that God exists. I'll give a few evidences. I'm convinced that the Bible is the Word of God. I give a few evidences. I'm convinced that Jesus is the Christ, the Messiah, and I give a few evidences. And then I talk about, for my own sake, I was dyed-in-the-wool introvert, and my way of operating was simply stay out of trouble. And what has God done with that introverted, stay out of trouble guy? Well, he's taken him around the world, and I've done debates in front of universities and so forth, and I get into trouble all the time with that, but that's just a testament to God's work in me. So, and I also, when I use that word convinced, and I stop and explain that to them. If all I say is I believe this or that
doesn't work.
In today's culture, if you say you believe something, well, then it's like a fairy tale.
Yeah. It's a Bible story.
It's a Bible story.
Yeah.
And if you tell them, I'm convinced, that indicates you've done some research into this, you've gathered some evidence, now you're convinced that this is true. And I think it makes it a better point.
Well, I do want to put Ray on the spot to talk about woodpeckers right after the break. But Sue, just before we do so, if somebody's listening to this right now, maybe it's a student listening to it, maybe it's a parent, maybe it's a grandparent, and they're saying, I'd like to know some more, or how do I go about, first of all, filling out an application? We mentioned in passing there oftentimes are scholarships available for needy parents and things of that nature. How can they go about beginning to register for what's going to take place June 15th to the 21st?
Well, if you go to probe.org, and right up front, you will see a link to Mind Games 2025. On that page are a number of links to, for example, the schedule, but there's an online registration. There is a scholarship request form. And so just work your way on that page. And it's pretty easy, actually, to register. And that comes to us. We send camper forms to everybody and get the ball rolling.
Yes. Let me just mention, too, there's some videos there. There's one about 7 minutes long, and even as we're going to a break, you could probably watch it or watch it later. There's a recap, which is about 3 minutes long. So it gives you a little bit of an idea, because you say, okay, what am I exactly getting into? Of course, we have some pictures and all of that. And I think one of the things that students love is not only eating the dinners with you, but it is a camp. I mean, there is some fun. And matter of fact, a fair amount of fun that takes place there. So you can see the lake and you can see the camp and get a sense of that as well. When we come back from the break, though, I thought it'd be really good. Dr. Ray Bohlin wrote this book many years ago. I've got the 1984 edition, but there is a section there about woodpeckers. And, of course, I've spoken on that, and he's spoken on it as well in terms of the tongue or the beak of the woodpecker. But more recently, he gave a message at the conference that we were promoting here through Discovery Institute, and the response was very great. And I think it also just gives you a little bit of an idea of what it would be like if you were sitting in the classroom. One of the questions I know we sometimes get is, I know I can send my children or grandchildren, can I sit in the back? Because I want to learn these things as well. So we'll get into that. But if you have more interest in this, go to probe.org, probe.org, and we have a link on that on our website. We'll be right back.
The Bible tells us not to worry, and yet there is a lot of worrying stuff in our world today. Thankfully, the Bible doesn't stop at telling us not to worry. God gives us a next step. He says we need to pray. But sometimes even knowing what to pray can be difficult, and that is why Point of View has relaunched our Pray for America movement, a series of weekly emails to guide you in prayer for our nation. Each week you'll receive a brief update about a current issue affecting Americans, along with a written prayer that you can easily share with others. We'll also include a short free resource for you in each email so you can learn more about the issue at hand. Will you commit to pray for America? Go to pointofview.net. Click on the Pray for America banner at the top of the page to subscribe. Again, that's pointofview.net. Click on the Pray for America banner. Let's pray together for God to make a difference in America.
Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again in studio with us, Ray and Sue Bohlin. I might just talk about the fact that, again, we have information about the Mind Games Camp. You can find that on our website, pointofview.net, or simply go to probe.org to find that. Beneath the banner for the Mind Games Camp is a piece on the common woodpecker, chance or design. This is a presentation that Dr. Ray Bohlin gave. He's a research fellow with the Discovery Institute. He gave it recently. It was very well received, and as I pointed out just a minute ago in his book, all the way back in 1984, he mentions a little bit of the uniqueness of the woodpecker in terms of the beak and tongue, but he's taken this and expanded it dramatically. So if you go there, you can actually watch the video. And you all know that you probably have young children that are kind of interested in nature. This would be something I think they would find fascinating. And every day, my wife and I walk in the morning, and I walk past two woodpeckers. I don't see them, but I can hear them, as quickly as they can bound their beak into the trunk of the tree. And so, Ray Bohlin, talk about this for just a few minutes, because this is maybe also a preview of the kinds of things you cover in the Mind Games Camp.
Yes, one of the things we offer that's very unusual for some is that we offer an alumni track. So some students who come back, they don't want to hear all the same lectures, so we offer them 4 or 5 new ones they haven't heard before, just for alumni. And this may be my alumni session for this year. And, well, woodpeckers are just strange creatures. I mean, they bang their heads in the trees. I mean, it's just bizarre. And they have reasons for doing that. And they want to expose tunnels in the tree where there would be insect larvae or insects, whatever. And then they just insert their tongue, go up and down, and they have very sticky saliva. They have barbs on the end of the tongue, and so they bring them back in, and that's breakfast. But you may have thought something weird about what I just said. They stick their tongue into the tree and search up and down the tunnel.
Yeah.
And, well, some woodpeckers can extend their tongue 3 to 5 times the length of the beak. And they have a very complex system of tongue recovery and ejection, if you will. And that's part of what I talked about in the Natural Limits book, was basically about the tongue, not much else. But for this talk, I did quite a bit further research, and we've been learning a lot more about woodpeckers. And one of the things that really surprised me is how these evolutionary writers could not stay away from design language. They just couldn't do it. For instance, here's one that says, talking about the woodpecker tongue and so forth, stands as a marvel of evolutionary craftsmanship. Another one, orchestrating a biomechanical symphony, paints a vivid picture of an evolutionary masterpiece.
Isn't that just amazing?
At the heart of the woodpecker's pecking prowess lies a biomechanical rhythm orchestrated with unparalleled precision.
Yes.
The woodpecker's remarkable ability to absorb impact is not a stroke of luck, but a result of millions of years of evolutionary innovation. I thought only human beings innovated things. It says the woodpecker stands as a living embodiment of nature's engineering brilliance. Engineering brilliance. I'm sorry, it's nature. It can't engineer anything. It's just not what it does. But they can't avoid that. They can't avoid that kind of language. And there are so many unusual things now that we found out that you tried imitating the drumming on the table here, but some woodpeckers can drum up to 25 pecks per second.
Wow.
I don't know. I can't do anything 25 times per second.
Certainly not with your head.
Let alone move your head that fast. They have incredible neck muscles. They have a way of absorbing that impact and spreading it throughout the body. They can generate a force of up to 1,200 Gs. Now, you can cause a concussion in a human with only 100. So that's almost 12 times that. And so they're not absorbed, they're spreading it. They don't really absorb it, they spread it. And also all that pecking into the wood, a lot of specks fly out, okay? And and they have a special membrane over their eye. It's called a nictitating membrane that as soon as they're just a fraction of a second before the beak hits the tree, that nictitating membrane closes. And the other thing it says is that it also helps the eye from popping out.
Yes.
Because the eyes are stationary and that skull takes an abrupt stop.
Yeah.
And you want to keep those eyes in there. So, where do some of these things come from? And but I just love what I just read. All this clear design and engineering talk ascribed to nature. Nature is dumb. It's stupid. It doesn't engineer things.
I might just mention you can, I think it's about 40 minutes long to watch the entire video and the questions and everything, because the questions just went on and on. Sue, you were in the room, right?
Yes.
And they were not just skeptical questions. They were just really curious questions, weren't they?
It was really fun to hear the questions, not from scientists, but for people, just Joe, normal people sitting there in the seats who heard someone make a presentation that put the cookies on the bottom shelf, and it fascinated them. They weren't asking these very, very specific scientific questions. They were just like, please tell me more. And they were so enjoying it. Kids who were there were so enjoying it. And it was a real blessing for me to see the level of excitement of the people in the audience.
One of the things that Ray has also mentioned when he looks at the cell, how they use the language of intelligence as well. The DNA is transcribed into RNA. RNA is translated into proteins. They just cannot help themselves. They believe that all of this happened because of mass, energy, chance, and time.
Yes.
And yet they see the evidence of design, and they are working so hard to try to say, well, it looks like designed to you, but it really is not designed. But they really play their hand poorly, don't they?
They absolutely do. And I've been making that point for decades now about what you just mentioned with DNA, RNA, and protein, because basically DNA and RNA have one language and protein's a completely different language. So there has to be a translation from one language to another. And you can't avoid that kind of terminology. It accurately describes what is happening. And just like I read with the woodpecker here, that you just can't get away from the design language. And sometimes I wonder, do any of them feel guilty after they said these sort of things? Or did they just think this was really extremely well said or whatever,
And again, when you talk about a DNA code, well, that would imply you have what? A code giver or something.
Genetic code, yeah.
Yeah, so, and again, Stephen Meyer's been on the program. You've known him. I've known him for decades. Says that really when you look at this code, it's ones and zeros, that even Bill Gates has said the code in the DNA is more sophisticated than the codes they write at Microsoft. And that, I think, should tell you that maybe it didn't all happen by chance.
Maybe not.
Yeah. Well, let's, if we can, and we're going to take a break in just a minute, talk about why you have a probe Periscope program as well. We have, of course, the Mind Games Camp, which is taking place in June, but any church can do this. And a lot of that, Ray, comes from the fact that when we were doing some of these college prep conferences and everything, we concluded that something was changing, and the younger you are, the less likely you are to have biblical orthodoxy. Is that fair?
Yeah. We used to do Mind Games conferences at churches over a weekend. Friday night, Saturday morning, and sometimes we'd speak in the church on Sunday, whatever. But over time, fewer and fewer churches were asking us to do that, and those that did were having trouble getting people to attend. And so we could see something's not right here. The kinds of things we have traditionally offered seem to no longer be very interesting to people. So we did some research. We had the Barna Group work with us to do a survey, and we were definitely able to see that the vast majority of Christians do not have a basic Christian worldview. And so if they're not thinking that way, then why would they bother to defend their faith? A lot of young people today would simply say that everybody has their own ideas of what's true and what's not. And if I start defending my faith, then I'm telling them what they believe is wrong. And they don't want to do that anymore. So Periscope was something we put together to try to reawaken this idea of a profound faith that you live out day by day. And it's a 7-week, what we call an experience. We don't like to use the word curriculum or program or anything like that. It's an experience because it involves a 7-week sermon series. There's a 49-day devotional that Kerby wrote. And to give them input every single day. You can receive text messages, emails every day to remind you of what to do. And then there's also a 7-part video series with a facilitator's guide so you can ask questions and so forth.
We'll take a break, and when we come back, I want to get into it in more detail, but this would be a good time to go to probe.org. Right next to the piece on the woodpeckers is a section that says Periscope, the 49-day journey, and we'll talk more about all of that because there's some great material that's now on the website that you can use. We'll talk about that right after this.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes talking about Periscope. And again, it has the theme, See Above, Live Beyond. And I've gone to the website, to probe.org, and then clicked on Up Periscope. Or you can just go to upperiscope.com. What I see there is the Periscope. Kind of looks like a sonar chart there, as well as some of that. But it's a 49-day journey. Ray Bohlin and Sue Bohlin in studio. But Ray, let's, if we can, talk about the vision there was to take individuals through this 7 weeks. And this is all plug and play now. So a church could do this tomorrow. A small group could do it tomorrow. It's available to them right now. And you've got videos, you've got material, you've got a facilitator's guide, you've got music, you've got all sorts of things. So that basically, what? At the end of 7 weeks, what happens? do you
Well,
hope?
our goal has been at the end of those 7 weeks that people's faith has been fully reinvigorated. They've seen the scriptures that we talk about developing an eternal perspective. That means that your life here is just going to be a blimp in consideration with eternity. So we use the periscope image. It's the tagline is "See above, live beyond." The idea is that you're in the submarine. The periscope is you get out. You're surrounded by culture, which is the water. So you have to set up a periscope to see above that, to develop that eternal perspective. And then the idea of once you see above, you have to live beyond where you are in the water. And that's where we hope people come, what the place they come to. Because then our hope, our goal is that, well, then suddenly all this information we've developed over the years about worldview and apologetics will now be of interest. And we can reinvigorate some of that traditional aspect of our ministry.
Sue, let me come to you because the second week is on deception, and you just recently did a presentation at the Hope Center. By the way, all those videos are available there as well, and it's on deception. And part of the problem we found when we surveyed, the younger you are, the less likely you are to believe in Satan, less likely you are to believe in satanic or even kind of deception. And so how could you be successful in spiritual warfare if you don't even know that you're involved in a spiritual war?
Oh, man, that is so scary because we do live in a battle zone. And if you're not aware that we have an unseen enemy, if you are not aware that we are in battle, then you are on a battlefield basically in your underwear. And you don't have any weapons, you don't have any protective armor. And so no wonder the enemy is just picking people off left and right. So I had the privilege of talking about the reality of Satan and the demons and spiritual warfare and what supernatural tools that God has given us to protect ourselves and to push back.
And it does seem to me, Ray, that we're dealing with a young generation that has not been churched. The argument used to be that, well, they'll leave church for a while and then they'll come back like the swallows to Capistrano. Yeah. But the bottom line is a lot of these young people were never in church in the first place. And the surveys you've done in 2010 and then now 2020 show not only do they not come back, but more are leaving. Yeah. So this is really a critical issue, is it not?
Yes, the problem's gotten much worse since 2010 when we did our initial survey. And then about 31% of these 19 to 39-year-olds had a Christian worldview, but now that number's down to 21%. And when you add in all sorts of other aspects about how you live your Christian life, do you go to church 2 or more times a month? Do you read your Bible? Do you pray? Do you attend a Bible study, whatever? Those who have a Christian worldview and are actually living it out drops down to about 1 in 25.
Wow.
So, and that's just among Christians. If you compare that then in the whole population, that's about 1 in 2.
The reason I wanted to talk about this is it's now all on computer. There was a time when you'd have to get the books, you had to get the videos on DVD or whatever it might be. You had a CD with the music by an award-winning artist, and you had all sorts of other resources. Now it's all there. It is plug and play, is it not? And
yes,
so
it is.
If a church right now says, you know, I'm really worried about the next generation, I could show the videos. By the way, the videos have young people. None of us old folks are on those videos. And they're high-quality videos. We've got a sample that you can watch on there, and you can also, of course, hear the music, and there's even orchestration. If you happen to have a church that has a full orchestra, fine. If they just have a few guitars and a drum, there's all sorts of things that from start to finish, your church could do a 7-week or 49-day experience, couldn't they?
Yes, even for the music, the sheet music is available, so you can work with that however you want. The CD just has the actual songs on them. And so, like we said, we call this an experience, and it because it pulls together several different aspects of a Christian's life: worship music, devotional time daily, sermons, video curriculum. And so it's just far more than just a program or
Yes.
or an event.
And we're just thinking about some people might say, can I get some more information? And as I went to upperiscope.com, there's a button there that says contact, and it says, we're here to answer any questions. So let's say somebody's saying, I've got some college kids coming back, and maybe we'd like to do this while the college kids and the high school kids are all together.
Yeah.
Because I know churches that have done that, and I could allocate 7 weeks in my preaching and teaching series. There's sample sermons, there is music, there are videos to show, there's a small group curriculum, so you could really begin to develop that starting almost tomorrow if you wanted to over the next couple of weeks, couldn't they? And if people want to know how to do that, you have a contact section there, don't you?
Yeah, the book with the 49 devotionals over the 7 weeks is online at Up Periscope. We now have the videos are all online. Facilitator's Guide is online, and now we actually have the sermons have also been recorded. We did that here at the Hope Center in Dallas, in Plano, just a few weeks ago.
And I understand that you now even have the transcribed material of that as well?
Well, the captioning has been turned on because they're all on YouTube.
Yeah.
And so
then it creates a transcript automatically on YouTube, which is pretty fun. I use those all the time. So there you go. Everything you need is right there.
The AI is pretty good.
Well, we're just about out of time, so let me come back to the original, and that is on that website. It says, See the Threat of Cultural Captivity, and that really goes back to Colossians 2:8, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And that is the fact that we should see to it that we're not taken captive to the culture, and whether we're talking about the Mind Games camp in June, or whether we're talking about what's going on inside the church, there's a real concern right now about cultural captivity, isn't there?
Yeah, and there's philosophy that's according to the world, and there's philosophy that's according to Christ. Do you know any of the philosophy that's according to Christ? Would you even know how to recognize it? And that's what the Mind Games Conference is able to address. And Periscope is also designed and written out to address that lack of understanding in a believer.
Yeah. Well, again, we're just about out of time. Sue, any last comments? Because, again, if people want to know more about mind games or how they get picked up at the airport, you're kind of the dorm mom, aren't you?
The door mom. I like that, Kerby. Yes. Yeah. And my email address is on the Probe website on the Mind Games page. And I love to talk to anybody. My phone number is there. They can call me and ask questions. And I would love the opportunity to love on their kids.
Well, again, one last time, we do have information about that. First thing that pops up at probe.org is the Mind Games Conference. It happens in the Dallas area, June 15th to 21st, and there are all sorts of resources that you can find there. There's an online brochure. There's a place where you can register. There's all sorts of other information, but if you wanted to get a little more individual touch, you can contact Sue Bohlin. So, Ray and Sue, always great to have you on the program. Let's do it again.
Thank you, Kerby.
Let's take a break. This administration has given us a lot to talk about, and a Supreme Court case yesterday gave us a lot to talk about. We'll focus on that right after this.
It was not that long ago that censorship appeared to be almost inevitable. Free speech was being attacked and strangled in many places. And some of us wondered if this was the end. But now, many feel a new sense of hope, a chance for a fresh dawn. Let me caution you, now is not the time to relax. It's a time to press forward, to use this fresh opportunity to proclaim and learn how to apply truth to current issues. By the fact you're here, listening right now, that tells me that you recognize the vital role Point of View plays as a voice of truth. For more than 50 years, we've informed and equipped people who have made a real difference. And when you give to Point of View today, you breathe life into what can be a new golden era for the truth. Please, take a moment right now and invest in truth. Visit pointofview.net or give it 1-800-347-5151. That's pointofview.net. Click in now or call 1-800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
going through the stations and caught Kerby and a very interesting topic. So just listening to it, and so just by hearing the topic, I can relate to some of those topics. But it has impacted my life a lot. I enjoy listening to the station.
I appreciate Point of View. You've been great and wonderful. A lot of information, and I really appreciate all your work you do.
My wife and I have listened to Point of View for about 17 years now. We just want you to know how much you have meant to us in our lives. I've gotten a real education since I've started listening to Point of View.
I want you to think, what would we do? How ignorant would we be if we didn't have Point of View? And come on, guys, give something to Point of View to make sure we don't lose this wonderful voice. And thanks again for what you do.
Thank you, Kerby. I consider this my school time, so my 2 hours of school each day. So thank you very much.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Second hour today, let's, if we can, talk about a case that came before the Supreme Court yesterday. Thought about playing some of the audio clips there, but it gets into some of the minutia. But first of all, the back and forth between, first of all, Ketanji Brown Jackson and the individuals that were supporting the parents was a little bit embarrassing for a Supreme Court justice. Either she hasn't done the research or her staff has not prepped her, but in either way, it didn't come off very good for her. And it's not the first time some people that are court watchers say that she's sort of missed and taken a swing and missed the ball. But nevertheless, also then Neil Gorsuch really kind of drilling down with the people from Montgomery County was worth a listen as well. But again, unless you understand the background, wouldn't make a great deal of sense. So let me give the background, because some of you might say, what in the world are you talking about? Turns out the Supreme Court yesterday heard the oral arguments in a case called Mahmoud versus Taylor, which, as the very interesting editors, and I think very on-target editors of National Review said, illustrated the extremism of the defenders of woke education in general, and in particular, what was going on with a school board in a deep blue county, Montgomery County in Maryland in particular. What it had to do with is that in this particular case, these various LGBTQ inclusive storybooks were presented to and read to children, in some cases as young as 3 years of age or 4 years of age, depending on where they were in the kindergarten, in the pre-kindergarten area. And then these lessons were also incorporated in the English curriculum to smuggle them in as reading lessons, because these ultimately would have probably had a better place in probably middle school or even better high school in terms of human sexuality. Now, again, I recognize that I like to make a joke from time to time about how old I am, and when I went to school, the Earth's crust was still warm, and Abraham Lincoln was the president, all that. Of course, that's a big joke, but let's just face, for those of us who are older, when's the first time you covered anything related to reproduction, human sexuality, sex education? I think the older listeners here said, if we heard it at all, it was in high school. Even some of the younger ones might have said, well, we might have heard some of that when we'd had biology classes in junior high. But I guarantee you, you were not actually reading this kind of material in the fourth grade in your English class, nor were you hearing about this in pre-K or kindergarten. So this is, first of all, before I get into all the legal issues, and fortunately we have Lathan Watts coming tomorrow to, first of all, clarify any mistakes I might have made, but I don't think I will make any, but more importantly, give us a little more of the behind the scenes. But what we're talking about is a case that should not have even made its way to the Supreme Court. I mean, we're talking about basically exposing and, frankly, in some cases, indoctrinating young children into sexually explicit material, in material that has to do with gender and gender differences and sexual orientation and drag queens and on and on and on, should, I don't think, even have made it to the Supreme Court, which again underscores why maybe the election of Donald Trump, whether you like him or don't, if you're listening to this program, you probably have some things that you agree with Donald Trump about, some things you disagree with him. But one thing I would imagine most of our listeners would agree is Donald Trump is going to likely put some more judges on the appeals court and maybe even in the Supreme Court, and that is the case because you have to be asking the question, and I want to ask this tomorrow of Lathan Watts, how did this even get as far as the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals when this probably could have been set aside by a federal judge? Certainly could have been set aside by the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals, and yet, nope, it went all the way to the Supreme Court, and that tells you a lot about the work that we have to do in the future. Okay, let's get into this. This first article you can read by Dan McLaughlin. He talks about the fact that religious parents sued, arguing that they had a First Amendment right to opt their kids out of this, you think? And this was then taken on by the Becket Fund for Religious Liberty. Representing them shrewdly made a Muslim family the lead plaintiff in the case, thus putting Montgomery County in a kind of an uncomfortable position of at least having to concede that they'd have to let Muslim parents have their children opt out if there was a lesson that showed pictures of Muhammad. So the fact is, instead of the fact that they could have just used Christian kids and Christian parents, they used Muslim kids and Christian kids to illustrate the point. And it, of course, put the school district in a little more difficult set of circumstances. But that didn't keep them from saying, well, these Muslim parents are a lot like white supremacists. As one person jokingly said, this is one of the few times where some of these very radical progressives actually were able to bring together Jews, Christians, and Muslims. But I digress. Let's go on. There were attempts to try to defend this, and they didn't work very well. For example, he says the plaintiffs cited 3 different standards for the First Amendment violations. He goes into what those are, and Justice Neil Gorsuch pressed both sides on whether it's necessary that to show the government's actions were coercive if they can show that they were discriminatory. Then they goes on to say that it's a good sign that your position is indefensible when it requires you to make arguments that defy plausibility, present ludicrous analogies, reverse your usual posture on procedure questions, or require unrealistic burdens of proof on the other side. It was not a good day for those trying to defend the, first of all, the administrators, and then the school board, and then even the previous rulings on these particular issues. So when we come back, I want to get into this in a little bit more detail because it is, I think, one of the key religious liberty cases of 2025. It's also one of the key religious liberty cases related to parental rights of 2025, though tomorrow we'll be talking about another case that is being pursued as well by our friends at Alliance Defending Freedom. And that is in addition to what we'll talk about on Friday when we have our lawyers from First Liberty Institute talking about a case also defending religious liberty as it relates to parents and school choice. So this, as these decisions come down, will mean that we've already had more religious freedom in 2025 than we've had in probably 40 years. But it's quite possible we'll have even more freedom after the Supreme Court rules on some of these cases. So I wanted you to know about the case. We'll probably spend some time tomorrow talking about it with Lathan Watts, maybe even a little bit with a few others, Jeff Mateer and some others. But importance of all of it is going to come down when the court finally rules. And the only real question is whether it's going to be 9-0, I doubt. Probably more like 7-2 or 6-3 based on some of the crazy things some of the liberal justices said, but we'll come back and talk about that right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
2 decades of lying, stealing, and wildly nefarious trade practices. Many admit that they made a mistake letting China into the World Trade Organization. The communist leaders came in with ambitions of global dominance and used the special rules and treatment to operate inside the United States and all over the world with little scrutiny, even buying up American farmland next to sensitive military sites. China steals intellectual property and then uses it to put American companies out of business. Tech Diplomacy reports after acquiring intellectual property, Chinese government subsidies and regulations help Chinese companies secure market shares in the global markets at the expense of the U.S. And according to a CNBC survey, 1 in 5 corporations say that China has stolen intellectual property within the last year, and 1 in 3 said that it happened sometime during the previous century. China has used its Belt and Road Initiative to gain foothold in African countries. Katie Pavlich tells the sad story of how China helped build infrastructure in Zambia. Their government started to take out loans from Chinese banks for airports, hospitals, housing projects, and the roads connecting them. In the end, not only were the so-called loans an unforgivable trap, but the infrastructure was also built with Chinese labor, not locals, and it's falling apart just like the cheap Chinese goods sold at Walmart. Trump has had enough and is now slapping reciprocal tariffs on China. That is why Katie Pavlich and many others are celebrating that China finally gets its due. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free booklet on a biblical view on big data, go to viewpoints.info/data. That's viewpoints.info/data. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, the first article, of course, is one by Dan McLaughlin, Religious Liberty at the Supreme Court is what I called it. Before I get back to that, some of you might say, well, can you give us some examples of what we're talking about? And I've always had difficulty with that. I remember years ago sending out an appeal letter to our donors and our partners and talking about something that was in the schools at the time that was really promoting, I think, pretty blatant sexuality. And I had a parent, I remember her well, in Arkansas that said, I don't know. I trust you, Kerby, but this really doesn't seem right. She went to her school library and found the book. And then, first of all, went to the librarian at the front and said, I didn't know this book was in here. Can I see whether or not my daughter has checked this out? And the librarian said, well, no, you don't have a right to see what your daughter checked out of the school library. And she said, what? She's my daughter. And so anyway, she sat down. I think she figured out a way that she could use the photocopier there at the school library, made some copies. And she wrote back and said, Kerby, first of all, not only were you right, you really downplayed how bad this was. And I said, well, that's because I was sending it out. And so again, let's just give you a few examples. These come from Gary Bauer. They were not in the article, but Gary went through and talked about the fact that, for example, one of the books, which actually was an inclusivity lesson, was one that was given to 3 to 5-year-olds. It was called Puppy Pride. It's about a family dog that gets lost at a homosexual pride parade. And of course, first Gary Bauer says, what are taxpayer-funded public schools introducing 5 and 6-year-old kindergartners to gay pride parades? So that was one of them. Another one, A True Story of a Boy Named Penelope, is another book that was used in some of these lessons. Except, of course, as Gary says, nothing about it is true. It's a lie. Penelope isn't a boy. She's a young girl who thinks she's a boy, and it was written for 8-year-olds. I go through some others, but Gary Bauer had a couple other points to make. He says, first of all, it's radical, bad enough that radical bureaucrats are pushing this material in the schools. But what was worse is the Democrats in Maryland, in this very blue state and blue county, took away the right of parents to even opt their children out of these lessons. So essentially forcing the children to be indoctrinated. One of the parents that was part of the lawsuit is Grace Morrison. Since she's in the particular plaintiff's case, I think it's appropriate to say her name. Her youngest child has Down syndrome, and along with some other needs. I won't get into all those. And so Grace Morrison said it's even more difficult for a child with special needs to understand such bizarre concepts of a boy wanting to be a girl wanting to be a boy, a pride parade, gay pride, all that kind of stuff. And that was a point, by the way, that Chief Justice John Roberts made in one of the arguments. Well, let me come back just to finish off this section. We'll get on to some others because we have some other things. A question about whether Harvard should be tax exempt, whether or not we have the wrong narrative right now about deportation and others. But again, coming back to Dan McLaughlin, he said really the biggest fiction throughout this particular set of oral arguments was the insistence by the county and by some of the liberal justices there that this was just a presentation of blandly factual information about same-sex couples, about transgender people, about drag queens, I'll get to that in just a minute, in order to show these people exist. Never fear coercion, he says, they argued. The curriculum says the kids can be told they don't have to agree with what the teacher tells them. Well, that's when the Chief Justice John Roberts said, wait a minute, how realistic is it to tell a 5-year-old not to believe the teacher? I mean, seriously, let's bring some common sense into this conversation. And what mischief might that induce? Chief Justice Samuel Alito then read aloud from a book in which a little girl is told not to object to her Uncle Gay's wedding, and the county and Justice Sonia Sotomayor insisted that it was fine because the girl's objection was just that she wouldn't see him as much. Never mind, this is exactly the moral lessons that are getting taught in the children's books. So again, that's why I think it's going to be at least 6'2", probably could 6'3", or could be 7'2", but we'll see. And then again, that's where Justice Amy Coney Barrett observed, it presents a worldview, you think? And it tells kids this is how you should think about these issues. So it's pretty clear where the so-called conservative justices stood on this. What was so disappointing was where the liberals stood on something that should just be so obvious. But let me continue. Dan McLaughlin says one was another claim that the opt-outs have been eliminated merely for practical reasons. What, pray tell, was that? Well, too many people opt out, which should tell the school something. If when you provide an opportunity for parents to opt their kids out of readings about gay pride parades, about drag queens, about same-sex couples, about transgender people, about a girl thinking she's a boy, maybe that should tell you why you shouldn't be doing it in the first place. But again, I digress. And it's pretty obvious the school board wanted the kids to actually not escape. They wanted them to actually hear this, which is now where Justice Brett Kavanaugh remarked, and I love this line, I'm a bit mystified as a lifelong resident of the county, because he lives in Montgomery County, how this came to be. This is the hill we're going to die on, he asked. I like what Dan Kavanaugh says. If he's lived in Montgomery County that long, I doubt he's actually mystified. But it is doubtless bad news for the district that so many of the justices know the area and see it as the Supreme Court's backyard. The fact that it happened in Montgomery County, which is right next to, of course, where the Supreme Court is there. One last one, another deception pushed by Schoenfield, and especially by Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson, was there was inadequate evidence for the court to enter a preliminary injunction without knowing how these books were taught in particular classes. Now, this is where, if you listen to the oral arguments, you say, they made it very clear that they had all sorts of affidavits and things of that nature. So either she ignored them or her staff did not educate her about that. And then, along with Justice Sonia Sotomayor, complained that a prospective injunction might be highly specific about it, what presents the government from doing to evade its prohibitions. And that was a little more than inconsistent with the standards the liberal justices have been applying lately. Dan McLaughlin says, of Trump-related cases, which are actually on the emergency docket right now. And, of course, it was, as he said, absurd for Ketanji Brown Jackson to yell, "We're the clients in the classroom," when obviously they were not, because they could not be there when those educational programs were taking place. And also led on the notion that public education isn't coercive because parents could always just have homeschooled their kids. Don't you love that one? We want all the kids to be educated, and primarily in the public schools. But if you don't like what's in the public schools, even though your tax dollars are going for it, well, there's always the homeschool option there as well. And as Dan McLaughlin said, imagine her making that argument about, say, segregated public schools. Well, if you don't like the segregated public schools, you could homeschool. She, of course, would never have said that. And, of course, he goes into some other things as well, saying, if nothing else, some of her analogies were the most laughable part of the argument. She asked whether it was coercive for a gay teacher to have a wedding photo on his or her desk, completely missing the point that this is a case of the school's mandatory curriculum, not about some offhanded comment by a teacher. I mean, never would they punish a teacher that would have, I don't know, like a crucifix on her desk. You know, that would never happen, right? Of course, we've been talking about that for some time. She then asked, what happens if this is part of a school where student groups put up a Love is Love poster, again, ignoring the distinction between student speech and teacher-led classroom curriculum. And again, just the inability to deal with any of this as well. At the end, he says, if anything, Sonia Sotomayor had this long list of objections coming from the right about teaching some of this, which should, if nothing, illustrate the one-sided power of some of these school boards in many parts of the country. And we learned that during the pandemic and lockdown now, didn't we? And a lot of parents were shocked to find out what their students and their kids were learning, and in some cases what they were not learning once they looked over their shoulder when they did some of those Zoom educational projects during the pandemic and lockdown. Anyway, this is an important case. I spent a half an hour on it. We'll talk about it tomorrow with Lathan Watch. We'll be right back.
In 19th century London, two towering historical figures did battle, not with guns and bombs, but words and ideas. London was home to Karl Marx, the father of communism, and legendary Baptist preacher Charles Spurgeon. London was in many ways the center of the world, economically, militarily, and intellectually. Marx sought to destroy religion, the family, and everything the Bible supports. Spurgeon stood against him, warning of socialism's dangers. Spurgeon understood Christianity is not just religious truth, it is truth for all of life. Where do you find men with that kind of wisdom to stand against darkness today? Get the light you need on today's most pressing issues delivered to your inbox when you sign up for the Viewpoints commentary at pointofview.net/signup. Every weekday, in less than 2 minutes, you'll learn how to be a person of light to stand against darkness in our time. It's free, so visit pointofview.net/signup right now. pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, we're going to spend just a little bit more time talking about some of the other issues in the news. As a popular opportunity, we're going to tomorrow really get into a couple of issues. First of all, speaking of popular, this whole idea of populism. What about this idea of hostility towards populism? That is something that I've talked about in one of my booklets dealing with some of these trends and some of these historical cycles taking place. place, and populism has broken out not only in Europe, but obviously here in the United States. So William Barclay will be with us tomorrow as we talk about that. And then, of course, you've heard me talking about Latham Watts. They have a case right now about religious charter schools. And then I do want to get his comments about this one related to the teaching of sex education and all sorts of gender studies and a variety of other things in Montgomery County, because they actually filed an amicus brief on that as well. So it will probably be, again, an hour-long conversation focusing almost a half an hour on each one of those cases. And also maybe we'll drop in maybe a few other sort of religious liberty issues. This has really become kind of the big issue of 2025. Not that it wasn't a big issue under Coach Kennedy and some of that, but now that it's almost like the dam has broken and now the flood is coming the other direction, or the tide is going the other direction, whatever metaphor you want to use. And that's good news for those of us that for some time have been disturbed about some of the Supreme Court decisions and precedents. They seem to be going the other direction, and I have reason to believe that this particular case that we talked about the last half hour will come in our direction as well. As somebody said a while back, you ever get tired of winning? I don't know, but certainly First Liberty is 9-0 in their cases before the Supreme Court. I don't know, I can't even remember the last time Alliance Defending Freedom lost a case. So they're in the 90 percentile too. And that is good news. And so you'll hear some more about that tomorrow. Let's get into a couple of other issues. And I tried to take one commentary for each one of those issues. One is the issue of Harvard University. And this one written by the editors of the Wall Street Journal, much more skeptical, as I tend to be, about whether Harvard will lose its tax-exempt status. We might say, well, it doesn't seem fair that they have $50 billion in endowment. They shouldn't be getting a tax-exempt status, but your tax-exempt status should not be dependent on how much money you have in the bank, even though I think this is extraordinary, to put it mildly. But they point out here in this particular piece that the administration so far has frozen about $2.2 billion in grants after Harvard has refused to actually address some of the issues raised by the Trump administration. And so Harvard University has sued in response, and they argue that they probably will have a First Amendment case. So we will see. The IRS back in 1970 adopted a policy which at the time, again, this is when there was probably more hostility towards religion than there is today, but in 1970 they had a policy of barring tax-exempt status for private schools that engaged in racial discrimination. Now, as much as I would agree with that, I think trying to make that case from a constitutional point of view or even from a tax point of view is difficult. But again, you could say, why would we be subsidizing a church or a school or any institution that actually promoted racial discrimination? So that's what set up the decision then in 1983 and 1984. They list 1983, but I think the decision actually came out in 84 of removing the tax-exempt status of Bob Jones University, even though at the time, I remember when I wrote the column, I pointed out that they weren't engaged in racial discrimination. There were black students and white students. There were black students interacting with white students. There was no real segregation. It's just that they had a policy against interracial dating. I disagreed with that, but that wasn't the point. Was that sufficient to pull its tax-exempt status? So anyway, the argument being made on the other side of this by the editors of the Wall Street Journal is pretty straightforward, and that is when the case came down, you did have a dissent, and that was from, if I remember right, William Rehnquist. And so as a result, they argue that perhaps this court would be more accepting of that idea. And then they make the other argument, which I have already made before when you've heard me talk about Jonah Goldberg. Jonah Goldberg talked about one of those issues, that is, would conservatives be cheering when Donald Trump is no longer president, but instead President Ocasio-Cortez is the president and is in charge? Would you then be indignant if the IRS under her began to pull the tax-exempt status of churches and Christian organizations? After all, remember, the conservatives were indignant and very upset when the IRS, I think legitimately so, when President Barack Obama looked like he was targeting some of the tax exemptions of right-leaning 501c4 nonprofits. And so as a result, you have to say, be real careful what you wish for. If indeed the IRS can pull the tax-exempt status of Harvard, could a future administration pull the tax-exempt status of Liberty University, Wheaton College, John Brown University, whatever it might be? You can kind of get the idea. And so they are suggesting other ways to deal with this. One, for example, maybe eliminate the tax exemption for tuition waivers paid to graduate students and reteaching for teaching, and for radicalizing undergraduates would force colleges to shrink or eliminate politicized departments. And they go through a couple of other ideas that would certainly be a way in which you could address what is going on at Harvard University without pulling its tax-exempt status. Before it's all said and done, I really have difficulty believing that Harvard will lose its tax-exempt status. But yesterday I gave you the argument for from, again, lawyer John Yoo. Today I give you the argument against pulling their tax-exempt status, which comes from the editors of the Wall Street Journal. Given the fact that both groups are conservative, I think it shows you how difficult it would be, I think, to accomplish that. But we will see how that plays out in the next couple of weeks. One of the other pieces I wanted to address is this ongoing debate about Kilmar Abrego Garcia. This is the individual who has been referred to as the Maryland man, who nevertheless, as far as we can tell, is an MS-13 gang member who was supposed to be deported, but was actually stipulated to not be deported to El Salvador, which is exactly where he is right now, even though he's a citizen of that country. And as Cal Thomas points out, in politics, creating and then owning the narrative is the best way to deceive the public, especially when a compliant media helps promote it and ignores later information that contradicts the initial narrative. And he's talking about this particular situation with Mr. Garcia. He gives the long quote that I gave the other day from Tricia McLaughlin, who is the Department of Homeland Security Secretary, who said that he is an MS-13 gang member. He's here illegally. He's an alien from El Salvador. He's a suspected human trafficker. The facts reveal that he was pulled over with 8 individuals in car on a journey from Texas to Maryland with no luggage, which makes it pretty obvious that he was engaged in human trafficking. By the way, a story that nobody, even in the conservative media, has pulled up yet, but you hear it here. And then, of course, the idea that he was more than just a family man and a Maryland man. And so points out that the real Maryland man, that would be Chris Van Hollen, decided to visit Garcia in upgraded prison surroundings, came back claiming that Garcia had been denied his due process. And so, of course, this is going to be the ongoing kind of battle for some time. But then reminds us that at a time when the senator from Maryland could not meet with Rachel Morin, the mother, I should say, of Rachel Morin, who is Patty Morin, you do see an interesting contradiction. And the other day, Patty Morin, who is the mother of Rachel Morin, appeared in the White House briefing room, went through the rather sad, and I can't even go into all the details of how her daughter, a mother of 5, was raped, murdered, what they did with her body, and all sorts of other things as well. So it's a reminder that right now that's the narrative. It's the narrative that really many in the Democratic Party are going with. And to paraphrase what Brett Kavanaugh said yesterday, is this a hill you want to die on? Do you want to die on the hill of actually teaching explicit sexual material to young children? Is this the hill you want to die on? This individual that is obviously an MS-13 gang member, probably engaged, as we can tell now, of human trafficking, and that's the person that you want to defend? But nevertheless, that's what we see right now unfolding right before our very eyes. We'll take a break, come back with more right after this.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes, and let me just real quickly again mention that tomorrow we'll have William Barclay on with us by phone, and then we'll have Lathan Watts in studio. We'll get into some of those issues. Friday we have Jeff Mateer and Keisha Russell. I think that will be another great opportunity to talk about what is happening right now in the area of the judiciary, what is happening with religious liberty, and some really important cases that we are going to be following. And I'm predicting, and I'm pretty sure I'm going to be right on these, that we will win victories in each one of those. And it just, again, is good news for parents, good news for religious liberty. Let me mention that yesterday, I don't know, I missed this, was Earth Day. So that's my last article here, Save the Earthlings from Earth Day by Ken Braun. And I thought it was interesting because I can parallel that with a piece that came out recently by John Stossel. John Stossel has for many years looked at this whole issue of climate change. And you might say, well, why did he come out with a new video? Well, part of the reason for that is the UN Secretary General announced that the era of global boiling has arrived. Okay. global boiling. Of course, we recognize the climate has been warming over the last century. And in his climate myths that came out the other day, he talked about whether the Arctic will be ice-free, points out that actually if you do any kind of measurement, and if you watch the video, or of course I have a commentary coming out next week on this subject, and look at the graph, you see there's really no change. Myth number 2, polar bears are going extinct. No, we've talked about that before. Actually, the number of polar bears have increased dramatically since the 1960s, when the best estimates were about 17,000, maybe 19,000. Now at least 26,000 polar bears. And then the other myth, climate change has created a massive global food shortage. Actually, food production is increased dramatically. And I notice he's now got another video out with some other myths, so I may take the time to go through that new set of myths as well. But it all brings us back to this. When Earth Day first came about, I was in high school, and I was really into the environmental movement, still believe, as you heard us talk about recently with one of our guests, the need for us to be good stewards of the creation. But what began to be obvious was that when you start having people no longer talking about global warming, but global boiling, and the oceans are boiling, you say, okay, they sort of lost their perspective here. And when I was growing up in the San Francisco Bay Area, there was kind of a longshoreman philosopher by the name of Eric Hoffer. And he had a phrase that I thought was really good. Every great cause begins as a movement, becomes a business, and eventually degenerates into a racket. And this is why Ken Braun said the annual Earth Day, which occurred yesterday, is become kind of a racket. Earth Day Network talked about Our Power, Our Planet. That was their theme for Earth Day yesterday. And you have individuals that are even left of center. For example, the editors of Ramparts, which was definitely left of center. A lot of my friends in Berkeley read that, actually said that Earth Day would eventually be the first step in a con game that will do little more than abuse the environment even further. And Ken Braun says, well, I think we fulfilled that prophecy. But what about this? The theme is Our Power, Our Planet. And the emphasis is alternative sources of power. All for that. I would imagine, as a matter of fact, there's pretty good evidence that some of the power that my home gets comes from some of the wind turbines in West Texas, and some of them come maybe even from solar panels. Not against that, but the reality is that he points out that if you look at this picture put together of the Bureau of Land Management talking about renewable energy, he points out that a typical natural gas power plant needs 0.2 of an acre to operate. But if you wanted to get that same amount of power from wind turbines, you would need 370 times more land than are there. And these are wind turbines that are 300 feet in the air. We had Dr. Ray Bohlin in here, and he and I both love birds, and we can give you kind of our bird count, and we'll tell you that some of these raptors run into those turbines and get killed, and so there is the case. And so he then points out that, okay, well then let's go to solar. Well, again, you need 140 times as much land for solar panels as you would need for one natural gas plant. And then even has a picture of solar panels where these green hills are now completely covered in black panels in China. Seems like a good idea, but the most concentrated energy is in fossil fuels. Or if you want to go to the next step, the even more concentrated energy is in nuclear, and points out that switching to land-devouring wind and solar energy would be a backward step. If you want to actually be progressive, go to nuclear power because it's a carbon-free electricity. And to get the energy embedded in 17,000 cubic feet of natural gas or 120 gallons of oil requires a uranium pellet no bigger than the end of your thumb. That's all you need. And so you have to recognize where the concentrated energy is. And so, again, he points out that even though there has been this push and sort of utopian push for alternative sources of energy, and as good as those can be as alternative sources, they can't be the primary source. Then he talks about the fact that last year's Earth Day theme was planet versus plastics. And first of all, let's acknowledge that some of these microplastics are causing harm. We haven't talked about this much on the program, but it is something that needs to be addressed. But he also points out that now so much of what we used to consume, which took trees and turtles and elephants, and he gives you this long list, now is available because we can turn petrochemicals into plastic. And certainly plastic health and safety devices have saved lives, prolonged lives. And we also find that oftentimes it is a way to waste less food, to pay for it less. And it also provides all sorts of consumer products, and he gives you a long list of that as well. And so, again, we just have to understand that if we are concerned about plastic, probably the best country to address that issue is, drumroll please, America. It turns out that even though Americans consume more plastic than any other country in the world, we actually use and recycle it much more efficiently. Indians mismanage 11 times more plastic waste. Tanzania's 29 times as much. And so the point he's making is that if you really try to apply just basic common sense and have a desire to be a good environmental steward, you're going to recognize that some of the things that have been the mantra of the Earth Days and of the Earth Day Network just don't work. And he quotes from a variety of people, including, Michael Schellenberger, founder and president of Environmental Progress. We've quoted many others over the years. And so if you're going to be concerned about the environment, and I think Christians should be on the forefront of being concerned about taking care of the creation, I think you need to get all the facts. When you get a lot of the facts, you find out some of the things that people were proposing aren't really very good ideas. That's all we got for today. We've got a lot to cover over the next couple of days, so I hope you'll join us then. Go to the website. You can find out more about the Mind Games Camp and about Periscope and much more. And most importantly, I want to thank Megan for help engineering the program. Steve, thank you for producing the program. And we'll see you back here tomorrow, right here on Point of View.
It was not that long ago that censorship appeared to be almost inevitable. Free speech was being attacked and strangled in many places. And some of us wondered if this was the end. But now, many feel a new sense of hope, a chance for a fresh dawn. Let me caution you, now is not the time to relax. It's a time to press forward, to use this fresh opportunity to proclaim and learn how to apply truth to current issues. By the fact you're here, listening right now, that tells me that you recognize the vital role Point of View plays as a voice of truth. For more than 50 years, we've informed and equipped people who have made a real difference. And when you give to Point of View today, you breathe life into what can be a new golden era for the truth. Please, take a moment right now and invest in truth. Visit pointofview.net or give it 1-800-347-5151. That's pointofview.net. Click in now or call 1-800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.